Maggie, Her Fatal Legacy, written and read by John Sargent. John, not all of them liked you, Pauline confided over lunch. She smiled, and I tried not to look too concerned. We were among a group of 6 who regularly ate together in a vast dining room served by ever-attentive waiters. I had given my first talk on a cruise ship, and inevitably it was my references to Margaret Thatcher which had caused some doubt. My instructions as a temporary member of the crew were quite clear. Printed notes awaited me in my cabin, and I was slightly surprised to learn that on board the pride of Fred Olsen's fleet, the Black Watch, we were not expected to engage in discussions about politics and religion. It is reasonable to ask, what on earth was I doing there? Certainly not, had been my response when the agent had phoned me. But John, he tried to interrupt. No, I went on, certainly not. He didn't give up. But John, you would start in Tahiti. Oh, I responded. Then you would go to the islands of Bora Bora, Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, then Auckland, and you'd fly back from Sydney. Sometimes it's best to admit when you've got something completely wrong. I announced gravely, when I said certainly not, that didn't necessarily mean no. All those years listening to politicians had not been wasted. This was the spring of 2004. I had spent a good deal of the previous 18 months preparing a book on Margaret Thatcher. Now I was meeting a group of people, mostly of the same age as the former Prime Minister, who might not take kindly to my less than reverent approach to the subject. Pauline, my companion at lunch, confirmed what I had already guessed. Fortunately, the majority of those who attended the talk had been interested and at times amused by my rambling account of my life as a political correspondent being dragged along in the wake of the most controversial Prime Minister in recent British history. For years my party piece, very definitely not a Conservative party piece, has been my account of the final days. It includes some explanation of how I stood outside the Paris embassy on a cold November night in 1990, solemnly telling 13 million television viewers that Mrs. Thatcher would not be coming out to comment on her disastrous showing in the leadership election. My earpiece, which was meant to connect me with the backstage team, was not working. So I did not hear the newsreader, Peter Sissons, intervene with the alarming phrase, "John, she's behind you." A large part of the audience immediately sensed this was a great moment of political pantomime, and it appears that 13 million people shouted at me, "She's behind you." This could have been a career-threatening moment, but such was the genuine confusion at the heart of government that my role in bringing this incident live to homes across the country elevated rather than depressed my reputation. I was greatly helped by the behaviour of Bernard Ingham and another official from Number 10, who appeared to be pushing me aside as they searched for a microphone. I wrongly assumed they were looking for my microphone, and in my usual helpful way, I said, "Here is the microphone," thrusting mine forward. This seemed to make them angrier, and it has even been suggested, though I have always denied it, that Mrs. Thatcher hit me with her handbag. The truth was that they were looking for another microphone, which had been set up near the main gate, so that Mrs. Thatcher could speak to the high-powered delegation from the British press, who were none too pleased with my BBC exclusive. Mrs. Thatcher had been so keen to be rid of the distasteful task of admitting that she had failed to win the first round of the leadership ballot that she gave her comment to me, and then disappeared back into the embassy. She thanked those of her MPs who had supported her in her battle against Michael Heseltine and promised to put her name forward for the second ballot, but it was not to be. 2 days later, she announced her resignation. What made the handbagging incident in Paris an award-winning event on television was that the Prime Minister looked as if she had lost her grip on power, and indeed she had, but not in the way the pictures suggested. This trivial misunderstanding outside the British Embassy had taken on the power of a political cartoon. Unwittingly, Mrs. Thatcher, with a little help from me, had provided a tableau which could have been entitled The Great Fall. I couldn't resist giving my elderly cruise ship audience one of my oldest lines. It made my career, and it finished hers. For many years after Mrs. Thatcher resigned, this had been my view, that her power had been broken. But after writing my memoirs during a final 3-year stint at Westminster as political editor of ITN, I had more time to reflect. The conclusion I came to is that Mrs. Thatcher's power to influence events certainly did not end with her resignation. She was to have an extraordinary Indian summer to her political career, and even now it is impossible to understand the present state of British politics without a clear grasp of the part she played after her departure from Number 10. In modern politics, it is hard for any Prime Minister not to look shop-soiled after 2 terms in office, let alone someone who soldiers on deep into their 3rd term. But nearly 14 years later, in the promenade lounge of this luxury cruise ship, it seemed there were few who did not feel that Margaret Thatcher had been Britain's last great political leader. It was not that they were all Conservative voters, but I think my jokes at her expense were only tolerated because they were funny. Any real attack on the former Prime Minister would not have gone down well. As they put on their evening dress for dinner, you felt a collective longing for order and respectability. These were not Thatcher's children we've heard so much about, but Thatcher's brothers and sisters, and if that BBC chap was a little bit iffy, they could take comfort in the fact that the lecturer taking over in Sydney would be Sir Bernard Ingham himself. When we returned home, Bernard and I swapped notes. I'd come to know him well during the 11 years he served as Mrs. Thatcher's press secretary. He did not like being called a spin doctor, but he became the first civil servant who increasingly filled that role. And I suppose, if he was a spin doctor, I was one of his patients. Often, twice a day, I would sit among a group of reporters taking the medicine from Bernard. A cross between a Yorkshire Terrier and a British Bulldog, with him, as with Mrs. Thatcher, the best kind of argument could only be expressed in straight lines, and if alternative constructions were offered, he would often react by reverting to his old catchphrase, bunkum and balderdash. He agreed with me that the passengers on the Black Watch held Baroness Thatcher in high regard. They must do, he said, otherwise why would they want to hear from me what it was like working with her? In his view, she had represented common sense, not the nonsense we have to put up with nowadays. But I then tackled him on the central, most disturbing question for anyone who takes that view. If she was so admirable, how can they come to terms with the fact that she was ditched by her own party? They can't understand it, Bernard retorted, and that is why people have become cynical about politics and politicians. And as for the Conservative Party itself, all these years later, he said, they've still not got over it. When visitors are shown round Parliament, the highlight of the tour is the chamber of the House of Commons. Most people are surprised that it is not larger and grander. On a guided tour, you're likely to be told about the new MP being shown round by an experienced colleague. It must be difficult, the new member suggests, having to make your speeches not to your friends, but across the chamber to your enemies. The older MP shakes his head. No, you've got that wrong. Your opponents sit in the benches on the other side of the chamber. Your enemies are on your own side. The way that Mrs. Thatcher was removed from office by her own side is the most dramatic recent example of the way battles within a party can be far more important than the set-piece jousting across the chamber. These internal battles are likely to be more vicious affairs, and as in a civil war, the scars can still be visible years after they might have healed following a war between states. The reason for that is fairly obvious. In a conventional war, the combatants have little choice but to fight for their country. In a civil war, most of those involved can choose on which side to fight. Votes in Conservative leadership elections are conducted by secret ballot, but enough of the argument has to be fought out in public for the battle lines to be drawn. For many Conservative MPs, the question had to be answered, are you with us or against us? And the answers were not forgotten. If you are not a Conservative supporter, you may be thinking, well, why should I care? The Tories got themselves into a mess. If they spend years trying to sort it out, that's their problem. But it is not as simple as that. The devastating effect on the Conservative Party of the divisions which led to Mrs. Thatcher's departure weakened British politics as a whole. The landslide Labour victories in 1997 and 2001 against an enfeebled opposition hardly improved the democratic process. The Conservative Foreign Secretary Francis Pym greatly annoyed Mrs. Thatcher at the start of the general election campaign in 1983 when he said, "Landslides on the whole don't produce successful governments." She thought it was hardly the sort of confident rallying cry she would expect from a leading member of the cabinet. But of course he was right. In the British system, the strength of the opposition matters. Weak oppositions weaken governments. They severely reduce the chances of ministers listening to sensible advice. For nearly 2 years I had been trying to work out the best way to approach the subject of Margaret Thatcher. Having retired from political journalism at the end of 2002, I was in a position to produce a more reflective assessment than is possible during the hand-to-mouth life of a reporter. I had many advantages over more distant observers, as well as a direct memory of the key events, and often some backstage knowledge picked up at the time. I was in a position to draw on contacts at the highest levels. What was lacking was a theme. I was increasingly drawn to the idea that I should concentrate not so much on the glory years, but on what happened after she resigned. Most of those who have written about the Thatcher era have been content to assume that it effectively came to an end when she left office. I knew this was not the case. I was just finishing an interview with Lord Hurd in the tea room of the House of Lords when I came across another former Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington. I have long appreciated his no-nonsense approach, and so I did not hesitate to ask him a direct question. How much influence did Lady Thatcher have on leadership elections after she had gone? He immediately replied, "She intervened in all of them, and always with disastrous results." He then grinned broadly, enjoying the surprise on my face. It was beginning to dawn on me that perhaps I had a theme. It would not take away from Lady Thatcher her main achievements, but I wanted to try to explain how Lady Thatcher tried to come to terms with being rejected by Conservative MPs, her deep sense of betrayal, and her determination neither to forgive nor forget. The consequences, not just for her but for British politics, were profound, and if I could clear up some of the bewilderment felt by the passengers on the good ship Black Watch, maybe that would be good too. I was acutely conscious of the need to be in touch with a small number of people with direct experience of how Lady Thatcher operated, both in and out of government. I hit lucky when the broadcaster James Naughtie and his wife Ellie gave a joint 50th birthday party in Richmond. I found myself queuing up for food with the former Conservative chairman and eminent Brussels commissioner, Chris Patten. I explained how I was writing a book about Margaret Thatcher and was hoping to talk to him. "Oh yes," he replied, "she destroyed the Conservative Party." At last I had my theme. For a Prime Minister to spend more than half an hour with a journalist is unusual. This was one of the thoughts buzzing through my head as I made the oh-so-familiar trudge up Downing Street one afternoon towards the end of July 2002. I was on my way to talk to Tony Blair about Margaret Thatcher. The policeman on the gate had greeted me in his customary way. "Hello, Mr. Sergeant. Can I check your identity?" I was never sure whether he realised he was being funny, but it always cheered me up. If you appear on television regularly, you inevitably have identity problems. People often believe you are an old friend. A woman once gave me a puzzled look and finally asked, "Are you someone?" It was a relief to reply, "Not really." Prime Ministers have a certain amount of fellow feeling for each other, especially if they have not been rivals. James Callaghan was once in a small gathering of former inhabitants of Number 10 and wondered how they might be described. He thought the most appropriate collective noun would be a denial of Prime Ministers, but that tells you more about his period in office than he perhaps intended. A pride of Prime Ministers is what most of them would like to be, lions who were able to take on the world and improve it as well. Mr. Blair, having recently won his second landslide victory, was often being compared with Mrs. Thatcher. Both of them could expect to have quite enough MPs not to worry too much about backbench opinion. Both of them had exceptional flair and vote-winning appeal. What surprised me during my interview with Mr. Blair was the extent to which he was prepared to acknowledge her strengths and to make it clear that he wanted to emulate her. Mr. Blair ushered me into the garden. "It'll be quieter here," he said. The garden looked cared for and peaceful, and this mood was matched by Mr. Blair's demeanour, but he'd aged considerably during his 5 years in office. Mrs. Thatcher suffered in a similar way from the strains of her premiership. When she first arrived at number 10, she gave off a kind of healthy radiance. At a Downing Street party, she told my wife how she got over the excitement of winning the election. "Oh, you can't stay on cloud 9 forever. You have to settle down to a routine," she said. But after 11 years, that routine of punishing days and short nights had taken its toll. When I met her at a Downing Street reception shortly before the end, the old radiance had gone. She appeared to be lecturing her guests on whatever topic she decided was safe and reasonably relevant. When she spoke to me, with the vein showing in her tired eyes, I thought for a moment she was addressing someone behind me. Like a faulty two-way radio, she was able to transmit, but not to receive. Mr. Blair had retained his directness, and quite rare in senior politicians, his ability to engage in discussion. But there was still plenty to concern Mr. Blair in the summer of 2002. He was worried about how his narrative might appear to future historians. The comparison with Mrs. Thatcher may well have been troubling him. His first term in office, apart from the dramatic decision to grant the Bank of England independent control of interest rates, looked cautious if not timid. Indeed, there were times when it seemed Mr. Blair could not decide policy unless his faithful polling expert Philip Gould had given the nod. The most notable exception was his decision to take on the Bosnian Serbs and their leader Slobodan Milosevic, who were forcing thousands of Albanian refugees out of Kosovo. Surprisingly, it seemed that Lady Thatcher had played a part. "I found her immensely helpful over Kosovo," Mr. Blair said. "She was not just very supportive, she was very kind personally. She was very good about advising me on how to take the military advice on board and how to use it." Much is often made about the loneliness at the top, how when the big decisions have to be made, you're on your own. One of Mr. Blair's virtues in the early part of his premiership was that he was prepared to be open about this. It was only later, when his more messianic side came to the fore, particularly over Iraq, that he found it difficult to admit to mistakes or even weakness. "It worked out in the end," Mr. Blair continued, "but there were points when it was very rocky indeed, and I thought at one point that we were really pretty extended in terms of our political credibility, and she was just very, very supportive at those times." "And her advice to you on this occasion was to trust your instinct?" I suggested. He nodded and smiled as he recalled what she had said. "You are doing the right thing. Don't pay any attention to the critics. Go on and get it done." He told me about his first encounter with Mrs. Thatcher during Prime Minister's Question Time. The young Mr. Blair had the temerity to suggest that the government were not taking responsibility for providing people with jobs, in stark contrast with the policy outlined in the 1944 White Paper on full employment. At which point, he recalled, she put her handbag up onto the dispatch box, opened it, and drew out the white paper. She then proceeded to slaughter me with various selective quotations. Mr. Blair was amazed that she'd been able to produce the right document without any apparent warning. How had she or her advisers made sure she was so well prepared? "I've never known to this day how they knew," he told me, "but I think that is where the term handbagging came from." This encounter with the first woman Prime Minister had made a strong impact on Mr. Blair. She was, he said, a very fine intellect. She had a really uncluttered mind, a very clear mind. Mr. Blair was speaking as one former lawyer about another, but as a politician what he most admires is the way that Mrs. Thatcher set a course for her party in government which radically changed the history of Britain. That is the aim of any Prime Minister, and apart from the post-war Labour government of Clem Attlee, the way her government responded to the challenge puts her ahead of any other British leader since Winston Churchill. When I travelled with her during the election campaign of 1979, a great deal of attention was given to the mere fact that she was a woman. There were even serious commentators who believed that she would not be able to overcome this apparent disadvantage. She was determined to remain feminine, and this was one of her great strengths. For some she might have seemed like a pushy mother. Conservative MPs would often refer to her as mother. To others she could be bossy and objectionable. To others still, she wore interesting clothes and could even be sexy. For me, her big attraction was that she provided an endless stream of stories. Her greatest strength was in her policies. Looking back on the manifestos on which the election was fought, it is clear that the spirit of the times was on Mrs. Thatcher's side. In the foreword she wrote, "There has been a feeling of helplessness, that we are a once great nation that has somehow fallen behind, and that it is too late now to turn things round. I don't accept that." She promised no magic formula, but it was determined that the balance of power between the individual and the state, which had increasingly been tilted towards the state, should be reversed in favour of individual freedom. The power of the unions, which had brought the country close to disintegration during the winter of discontent, would be reduced. Wealth creation and enterprise would be encouraged, income tax would be cut, and inflation would be kept in check by controlling the money supply. People would be given the legal right to buy their council homes, and what came to be known as privatisation of state assets would get underway. Labour accused Mrs. Thatcher of wanting to gamble with people's future on a return to the 19th century free market. To achieve full employment it would be necessary, they believed, to have longer holidays, earlier voluntary retirement, and move towards a 35-hour working week. Only in their acceptance of the need to sell off council houses did they seem to realise that the days of old Labour socialism were numbered. The mood of resignation, sometimes despair, which culminated in the winter of discontent, is hard to exaggerate. There was endless talk about the British disease, of poor industrial relations and strikes, and of low productivity producing low wages. I saw a group of Americans on a tube train travelling into London from Heathrow Airport. On spotting some allotments alongside the track, they leapt to completely the wrong conclusion. "Look," one of them said, "subsistence farming." I remember going to a reception for eminent businessmen in London at about the same time, and one of them turned to me and said, "Do you think this country is governable?" Mrs. Thatcher's first term in office was far from easy. In the teeth of a recession, the government decided to increase taxes. It was the most dramatic example of the importance placed on monetarist economics as a way of defeating inflation. The housewife, determined to balance the books, as Mrs. Thatcher had portrayed herself during the election campaign, was made flesh. An amazing total of 364 leading economists, nearly one for each day of the year, signed an advertisement condemning the policy. But the overall effect long-term was beneficial. The 1981 budget became the foundation for Mrs. Thatcher's claim that her economic policy helped to save the country. But every successful Prime Minister needs some luck, even if that involves being lucky with your enemies. For Mrs. Thatcher, the incompetence and unpleasantness of the military junta which ruled Argentina, in retrospect, seems heaven-sent. It was a series of classic British mistakes which encouraged Argentina to try to end a long and bitter grievance by carrying out an invasion. It was Mrs. Thatcher's fortune that, thanks to the bravery and skill of the British forces, the islands were finally recaptured. Mrs. Thatcher had even more luck with her enemies at home. Labour's initial reaction to her success was to turn in on itself. The left wing of the party, led by, among others, Tony Benn, managed to convince itself that what was needed was not less, but more old-fashioned socialism. Labour's civil war ruled it out of government for the duration of the Thatcher period and beyond. The 1983 Labour manifesto, which called for more nationalisation and a withdrawal from the European community, was famously described by one of their senior members, Gerald Kaufman, as the longest suicide note in history. With her landslide victory in 1983, Mrs. Thatcher was finally able to dominate her cabinet. She had spent her first term complaining that some members of her team, including Christopher Soames, Jim Pryor and Ian Gilmore, had been insufficiently radical. She described them as wet. They were worried about the effect on the social fabric of the nation, when her policies seemed to be intent on increasing the differences between the rich and the poor. She was concerned that unless the government acted quickly to reduce the power of the state and to encourage enterprise, her mission in politics would fail. The defeat of the militant miners, led by Arthur Scargill, produced the bitterest industrial dispute of modern times, and still scars the memories of many of those involved. For Mrs. Thatcher, it sealed the success of her second term. Coupled with her privatisation programme, which had been an enormous popular success, she reached the peak of her power with her second landslide win in 1987. For Tony Blair, this period of the Thatcher ascendancy contains much to be admired. He told me he was particularly impressed by her tremendous clarity of objective, matched by huge determination and vigour. Compromises were acceptable, but on certain key policies, he said, she never yielded her ultimate goal. She was a considerable Prime Minister, he told me. It is foolish for anyone, left or right, to deny that. She understood the importance of putting trade unions into a proper legal framework, and she understood the need to take an axe to some of the things in the public sector that were out of date. Without Mrs. Thatcher, it is often argued, Mr. Blair would not have become Prime Minister. I asked him bluntly, "When people say she is the founder of New Labour, what do you say to that?" "I think that's—" he paused. "Going too far?" I suggested. "Yes. The fact is, we were so badly beaten in the 80s that we finally realised that fundamental reform and not tinkering were necessary to get us back into power." For Tony Blair, there is no doubt that the success of the military engagement in Kosovo, backed by Lady Thatcher, was a turning point in his attitude to the United States, and led perhaps inevitably to the joint invasion of Iraq. There is a clear parallel with the Falklands War, when behind the scenes the vital part played by the American alliance strengthened Mrs. Thatcher's determination to be Washington's most important ally. But the parallel breaks down when you consider the electoral consequences. The success of the Falklands War helped produce a landslide for Mrs. Thatcher in the subsequent election. The intervention in Iraq became Mr. Blair's millstone, with many of his former supporters deciding that he could no longer be trusted. In classical Greek tragedy, the future is ordained. Hubris is followed by nemesis. Even at the height of a leader's success, a fatal flaw of character can emerge, and the seeds of failure are sown. For Mrs. Thatcher, the last electoral triumph would occur in 1987. She would never again win the formal support of British voters, but what happened in the last period of her rule would help set the tone of British politics until the present day, and it would take another political generation to understand fully why the glory days came to an end, and to appreciate what a disaster would befall the Conservative Party. Europe is the issue at the centre of our story. For a leader renowned for her consistency, the way she tackled the subject varied enormously throughout her time at the forefront of British politics. It is hard to imagine Baroness Thatcher having much good to say about an ever closer union in Europe, but those were the words used in the original Treaty of Rome which Britain signed up to. As Prime Minister, she joined leaders of other member states in supporting moves which led eventually to the euro currency, and an institutional structure she would later complain laid the foundations for a European superstate. For some of her colleagues it was always a matter of heart versus head. Mrs. Thatcher was a child of her times. As the daughter of a shopkeeper in the small market town of Grantham in Lincolnshire, she had direct experience of German aggression. She was not quite 14 when the Second World War began. Her hometown was surrounded by American air bases and was sometimes the target of German bombs. Margaret Thatcher spent a good deal of her time preparing for the school certificate exams, hiding under the kitchen table. It is not surprising that her political hero was Winston Churchill. I am nearly 20 years younger than she is, but as a child in the 1950s, I lived in a family of similar means at Great Tew in Oxfordshire. My father was the vicar. The simple pleasure we took in the fact that Britain had won the war came with an assumption that Britain was best. We may have been busy disposing of our empire, but that was for the good of the former colonies, not through any weakness of the mother country. If products were marked "Made in England," that would be a guarantee of quality. If we travelled abroad, it was assumed that the standard of the plumbing would not be as good as we expected at home. Not being able to drink water from the tap seemed particularly strange. What could be more straightforward than filling a glass of water? Like Mrs. Thatcher, I managed to get into Oxford University, but there our paths diverged. Whereas I was studying politics, philosophy, and economics, the future Prime Minister was stuck in a chemistry lab. But we both conformed. I became a middle-of-the-road student of the 1960s, supporting radical left-wing ideas, and she was soon a junior member of the Conservative Party. When our paths crossed, she was already leader of the Conservative Party, and the differences between us were immense. But this did not prevent me from enjoying being with her and catching some of the excitement of her political advance. She was different, and not just because she had broken the men-only rule. She was prepared to speak her mind, answer questions, and delight in her role as the woman in blue who had stormed the male citadel. I also found her overly serious manner rather amusing. It was sometimes said that Mrs. Thatcher became leader because she was the only one who had the balls to stand up to Edward Heath. Mr. Heath never forgave Mrs. Thatcher for deciding to take him on. The fact that he had led the Conservatives to ignominious defeat in 1974 was not a matter Mr. Heath was keen to dwell on. Mrs. Thatcher's alleged treachery was for him a far more compelling subject. Their relationship, if that's the right word, became known as the longest grudge match in history. But when she succeeded him as leader of the opposition, Mrs. Thatcher treated him with caution and respect. Within months she had to decide how the party should campaign in the Common Market referendum, which had been sprung on the public by the Prime Minister Harold Wilson. It was a curious campaign, with senior Labour figures led by the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins standing shoulder to shoulder with their usual opponents in the Conservative Party, such as Geoffrey Howe, the Shadow Chancellor, urging the public to vote yes. Mr. Wilson portrayed the ballot as a chance for voters to decide on the most important realignment in foreign policy since the Second World War. But it was really a skillful manoeuvre designed to see off Labour's anti-marketeers. The result was a massive endorsement of membership by a 2-to-1 majority. For a time, it looked as if the issue had been settled. Britain had made an historic choice. It had chosen to join Europe. Mrs. Thatcher made a number of conventionally pro-European speeches. In one of them, at Hendon, she argued that Britain must stay in Europe. The paramount motive for doing so, she said, is political. The countries of Western Europe, by working ever more closely together in economic and social concerns, are building bridges of reconciliation and understanding between peoples long divided by rivalry and conflict. Mrs. Thatcher was keen to learn. When she won the election, her eagerness to accept advice from senior colleagues was a great strength. Foreign policy in particular is notoriously difficult to master if you do not know any of the personalities involved. To begin with, she relied heavily on her Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington, whose well-cut suits and brisk upper-class ways gave off a super-confident air. Her first European trip as Prime Minister was to Italy, where attention to protocol, and perhaps a bit of theatricality, seems to matter. Mrs. Thatcher made the mistake of attempting to leave the British Embassy in Rome too early for her visit to the Italian President. The team of motorcycle outriders leapt onto their machines and their engines roared. I heard Lord Carrington coolly advise Mrs. Thatcher that there was a danger they would arrive before they were expected. A firm thumbs down was given to the outriders, their engines were stilled, and Mrs. Thatcher leant across to the accompanying reporters and said, "Well, let's have a chat." I did not want to reveal to my colleagues what was on my mind, so I did not spring in with a question. I wanted to ask Mrs. Thatcher later about her determination to make sure that Britain received more from the European budget. It was the first sign of steel in her relations with the other member states of the EEC, but I was anxious to cover it exclusively in the interview it had been agreed I would have for Radio 4's The World at One. Later, sitting in plush armchairs inside the embassy, she laid out the case which would dominate her European policy during her first term in office. This was the beginning of her campaign to see that Britain should not have to pay into the EEC budget nearly £1,000 million more than the country received in European revenues. It came to be known as the Battle for Maggie's Billion. None of her close associates ever called her Maggie to her face. She was always Margaret or Prime Minister, but she was quick to see that it was useful for headline purposes. There was always a populist streak in her approach, and when she was speaking in public, she would sometimes self-consciously refer to herself as Maggie. The public argument, which seemed to start almost casually in the drawing-room of the British Embassy in Rome, was to have a profound effect on Mrs. Thatcher's approach to Europe. Her attitude to the budget problem highlighted the traditional differences between Britain and the other member states. With the other leaders, there was always an emotional side to their attachment to the European project. It embodied their hopes of finally putting to rest the violent animosities which had pulled the continent apart. Officially, they were now Europeans, and individual countries were not expected to complain if they discovered that their position compared unfavourably with that of the other member states. It is greatly to Mrs. Thatcher's credit that she was unimpressed by what she would later refer to as misty Europeanism. For a variety of highly technical reasons, Britain was being forced to pay far more than other countries in relation to its wealth. She was right to fight for British interests in this way, and subsequent governments were in no doubt about the importance of Britain's rebate, which she eventually negotiated. But Mrs. Thatcher's blunt, pragmatic approach was received with horror by those who saw her as fundamentally anti-European. In the French phrase, she had shown herself to be totally unsympathetic to the idea of the esprit communautaire. There was also the simple point, disguised by this high-flown rhetoric, that if Britain was to put less into the EEC budget, other countries would have to contribute more. The other leaders were also fighting in the interests of their national budgets. At a news conference after a European summit in Dublin, she declared, "I'm only talking about our money, no one else's. There should be a cash refund of our money to bring our receipts up to the average level of receipts in the community." Mrs. Thatcher relished an argument, but she acknowledged later it was a strain. In her memoir, she says she knew the summit was going to be hostile and unpleasant. She said, "I went to Dublin with a newly tailored suit. Ordinarily, I would have enjoyed wearing something new on an occasion as important as this, but I thought twice. I didn't want to risk tainting it with unhappy memories." The new suit was not worn. Finally, in 1984, Mrs. Thatcher accepted a deal whereby 2/3 of the British deficit would be refunded. It was generally regarded as a victory, but as a consequence, she found it harder to find allies among European leaders, and it reinforced her distrust for what she later called that un-British combination of high-flown rhetoric and pork-barrel politics which passed for European statesmanship. Too much attention may have been given to the remark made by Harold Macmillan when asked what tested him most as Prime Minister. He replied, "Events, dear boy, events." It neatly encapsulates the pressures at Number 10 and the sense that however clear the skies, at any moment a storm can be brewing which could drive the government off course. But there is perhaps another answer which could also be given if Prime Ministers are honest about the difficulties they face, and that must surely be a clash of personalities. Those who have watched the political process at close hand are never in doubt that personalities matter. I remember at the height of the plotting against Mrs. Thatcher, a bewildered Conservative MP grabbed me by the arm and said, "But are we really in a Shakespeare play?" I nodded vigorously and replied, "The only question is, which play is it and who will win?" To understand the fall of Margaret Thatcher, we have to name names, and however much he may sometimes play down the role, there is one prime suspect, Michael Heseltine. He would have preferred many other titles, including the man who would be king, but among those proud to call themselves Thatcherite, there is only one that rings true, the assassin. When he toppled their queen in 1990, they called it regicide, and many of them were only half joking when they said, "Off with his head." I have to admit that I like him. Over the years I've watched him with interest, sometimes confidently stirring crowds, at other times proving surprisingly vulnerable. I'm not going to say that he would be a brilliant Prime Minister. That is too big a question to settle in a phrase, but he is certainly someone with whom I would be happy to go into the jungle. He has long since come to terms with his Tarzan nickname, an inevitable consequence of his golden hair, dashing style, and public school good looks. Only a child brought up in the jungle, it seemed, could have developed the skill required to swing from tree to tree, beating his chest to attract the attention of all who mattered. Throughout most of his career, he was one of the big beasts in politics. It was almost inevitable that he and Mrs. Thatcher would find that the cabinet was not large enough for both of them. They were so alike. It is surprising they managed to get on at all. At Westminster, or anywhere else where power is pursued, to be marked out for higher office can be a serious disadvantage. Rivals are alerted, jealousy is aroused, and smaller fry combine if they sense a common threat. For Michael Heseltine, dressed immaculately in an expensive suit, simply to walk into a room with a file under his arm and swing his long legs under a table was often enough to create a bit of a stir. I remember a female member of John Major's cabinet telling me she enjoyed watching Mr. Heseltine. "I just like to see what he's up to." It's usually assumed that someone like Mr. Heseltine must be up to something, and his actions were invariably judged in that light. As a student at Oxford, he was said to have sketched out on a piece of paper his future career structure in the most confident terms. 1950s, millionaire. 1960s, MP. 1970s, minister. 1980s, cabinet. 1990s, Downing Street. As he progressed firmly along that path, and every one but the last was faithfully accomplished, his denials that he had ever written such a note were easily dismissed. From early on, Mrs. Thatcher was in no doubt that Michael Heseltine was someone to watch, and she did not mean that kindly. The fact that they were not attracted to each other may not seem particularly relevant to those who view politics as a game of chess, but for those like me who have watched so many Westminster dramas in close-up, politics without emotion is not politics at all. You do not have to be an expert in body language to know what is going on. With some politicians, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown being the obvious current example, it is sometimes the only way of knowing that they are finding life together rather difficult. With Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Heseltine, the plain fact is that they didn't fancy each other. In fact, they did not even like each other. To employ the phrase that she used to distinguish her real friends from her political allies, he was never one of us. In June 2003, I spoke to Lord Heseltine about Margaret Thatcher. As the founder of Haymarket Press, he maintains a top-floor office at their modern headquarters in Hammersmith. His desk faced a large rack of magazines, and I could not resist pointing out that this was like working in a newsagent's. "It's different," he smiled, "when you own them." He had retired from politics, but there was still part of him that longed to be back in the front line. "I would like to do one more big conference speech," he mused. Tarzan was missing the jungle. At the first meeting with Tory MPs, the new leader announced that she would be accessible to all. "And besides," she said, "I want to be made a fuss of by a lot of chaps." Mr. Heseltine told me how appalled he had been. I sat at the back of the room and shook my head in disbelief. Part of Mrs. Thatcher's charm for many men was that she did have a flirtatious side. She would put her hand on your arm long before it became the standard technique for women bosses in the BBC. It could provide quite a heady moment for a supposedly hardened political journalist, and I was not immune from the effect, which was, dare I say it, almost sexy. But the Thatcher charms did not work on Mr. Heseltine, and he admits to finding her difficult to deal with as a woman. He expected to treat women with a certain deference. Seats had to be offered to them on buses. They should be allowed to have their say without interruption. But up against this woman Prime Minister, there were times, he felt, that a totally ungentlemanly approach was needed. He said, "You suddenly found that if you behaved in any way that allowed a chink of light to emerge in your defences, you'd have her tanks through it. You just had to realise that she'd always interrupt you, so you waited for her to stop, and you'd start again. And you had to start again, and again, and again, until she listened. Otherwise, you just get flattened. I found this acutely uncomfortable." I was determined to hear from others with a pro-Thatcher stance, and one of my key contacts was Norman Tebbit. He used to frighten me when I first met him. It was not so much his bother boy image, it was more the impression that he could not wait to take you to pieces in argument. Coupled with a black cloak and a pair of fangs, he might easily decide to eat you as well. When he knows that you appreciate the sharpness of his humour and his genuine smile, mellowness takes over, but you can never be certain this mood will last. Norman Tebbit argued that Mr. Heseltine's feelings about Mrs. Thatcher involved much stronger emotion than simple embarrassment. He told me that welling up inside Mr. Heseltine was his anger and humiliation at having to serve a woman as Prime Minister, particularly this woman. It is obviously a charge that Mr. Heseltine would reject. Mrs. Thatcher openly admitted that her relations with him had never been easy, but he was given promotion and even allowed to shine. First he was Secretary of State for the Environment, and he was then given his big chance as Defence Secretary, with the high-profile task of mounting a propaganda battle against the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Never too shy to wear a flak jacket when the press cameras were about, he loved this form of combat. Soon the Conservative Party began to be impressed, if not always to warm, to this rising political star. But the more he was successful, the more the tension grew between them. They had their first serious battle within the cabinet, and what made it particularly serious was that Mr. Heseltine won. Winning against a Prime Minister is always hazardous. Winning against Mrs. Thatcher carried the explicit danger that she might see it as a test of will, and would therefore at some point insist on retribution. The battle was over a government order in the defence field. It was not particularly significant in itself, but it was the vital precursor to the row that led Mr. Heseltine to storm out of the cabinet. Norman Tebbit, as Trade and Industry Secretary, was responsible for helping the ailing British shipbuilding industry. 2 nationalised yards, Camel Laird on Merseyside and Swan Hunter on Tyneside, both desperate for orders, were competing to build 2 frigates for the Royal Navy. Mr. Tebbit decided that Camel would only be allowed to bid for one of these contracts. Swan could bid for both of them. Mr. Heseltine complained that this was unfair. Swan would be able to spread the cost of the overheads over 2 contracts, so they would be able to offer a much lower price. The matter was discussed in a cabinet committee, and Mrs. Thatcher supported Mr. Tebbit. Mr. Heseltine refused to accept the decision. He returned to the Ministry of Defence, only to be told that the Prime Minister had already sent a conciliatory message. she accepted that a solution agreeable to him would have to be found. In the event, the 2 yards were allowed to build a frigate each at an extra cost to the taxpayer of £7 million. Lord Tebbit told me that the decision was only reversed after the intervention of Lord Whitelaw. Willie Whitelaw's rather bumbling patrician air disguised a sharp, practical skill at settling disputes. Everyone needs a Willie, Mrs. Thatcher once declared, oblivious to the double entendre, and Willie Whitelaw had another obvious advantage in her eyes. He was not fond of Mr. Heseltine, whom he once described as the sort of man who combs his hair in public. Almost exactly a year later, Mrs. Thatcher was pleased to get her revenge. It came in the sudden storm which blew up over the future of the only helicopter company in Britain. It led 2 cabinet ministers to resign and left Mrs. Thatcher severely weakened. It was called the Westland affair. Once again the argument was over a technical matter involving defence procurement. The West Country firm of Westland were hoping a bid from a giant American helicopter company, Sikorsky, would prevent them from going under and throwing thousands of people out of work. But there was also the possibility that a European consortium could save the company. Mrs. Thatcher firmly backed the American option. Mr. Heseltine was ready to risk his whole political future on promoting a European solution. It is not surprising that, in retrospect, this should be seen as the dramatic emergence of the fault line which was to split the Conservative Party for a generation, the extent to which Britain should play a full part in the political and economic integration of Europe. But a senior Conservative MP, Michael Mates, who became one of Mr. Heseltine's closest allies, is convinced that, for Mrs. Thatcher, it was a deeply personal affair. The row went on for weeks, and as often happens, in the short term it was only the political journalists who benefited. Some people would be badly hurt, that much was obvious, but for weeks it was not clear who they would be. One of the joys of working at Westminster, compared with being a war correspondent, is that despite all the nail-biting suspense, in the end no one gets killed. But the fate of the Trade and Industry Secretary Leon Brittan is the nearest Westminster gets to the military epitaph, "Killed in action." Mrs. Thatcher was determined to use him in her battle with Mr. Heseltine. As Mr. Mates puts it, she chased Brittan all over the place, saying, "What are you doing? The man's walking all over you." According to this account, it was after one such fierce row, when she gave Mr. Brittan an enormous bollocking, that he decided that part of a letter from one of the law officers should be leaked to the Press Association. The Solicitor General, Sir Patrick Mayhew, had said in a private letter that Mr. Heseltine had been guilty of material inaccuracies in his submission over Westland. Once the news agency published this juicy titbit, media frenzy ensued. Mr. Heseltine was, of course, livid. Eventually, Leon Brittan was forced out, following a particularly unpleasant meeting with backbench Tory MPs. He had become the official scapegoat, taking the heat off the Prime Minister. He was found guilty of losing the confidence of his colleagues, and there was even a whiff of anti-Semitism in the complaints made against him. Fortunately, Mr. Brittan, one of the cleverest men in politics, went on to follow a highly successful career as a member of the European Commission in Brussels, but his Westminster career was over. The obvious question is whether, given their particular temperaments, an almighty clash between Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Heseltine was bound to happen. On the morning he resigned, on January the 9th, 1986, Mr. Heseltine told Mr. Mates that he had no intention of taking that step. When the news came out later, Mr. Heseltine's wife Anne was taken completely by surprise. Her comment went into the quotes of the week columns. "Oh my God." It is clear that by the time the argument had reached this stage, it was Mrs. Thatcher who was determined to be rid of Mr. Heseltine. She announced to a meeting of the Cabinet that the only way to prevent any further escalation of this row in public was for all statements on Westland to be authorised by the Cabinet Secretary Robert Armstrong. Mr. Heseltine was told firmly he could not even repeat comments he had made in the past without authorisation. Mr. Heseltine recalls in his memoirs that she read out this policy from a note produced from her handbag. He makes the Thatcher handbag seem as ridiculous as the one in the importance of being earnest. He also sees it as a clear sign of a plot. Mrs. Thatcher was forcing him to make a choice, submit to her will or leave the cabinet. He still maintains there was no choice at all. He had to go. In keeping with the farcical mood which surrounded so many events in the Westland affair, members of the cabinet were not sure what Mr. Heseltine meant when he stood up and said that he must leave. The position was only clarified when Mr. Heseltine told a startled BBC cameraman outside No. 10 that he had resigned. He walked to the Ministry of Defence across the road from Downing Street. It became one of the longest walks in politics. It looked as if he would never return to government. Most of the cabinet could not believe that he was prepared to risk all in his shootout with Mrs. Thatcher. But Mr. Heseltine is still in no doubt about the correctness of his behaviour. He told me there are certain very clear conventions about the rights of cabinet ministers, and if you allow yourself to be trodden over, bypassed, ignored, silenced artificially, denied the right to put a case to the cabinet, that is the beginning of the end for you. You must never let yourself be put in that position. As journalists were being diverted by the fireworks of the Westland affair, the dull round of talks leading to the historically important Single European Act were coming to a conclusion at the Luxembourg summit in December 1985. The Single European Act is now seen as the vital precursor to the Maastricht Treaty. It is also the negotiation, undertaken personally by Mrs. Thatcher, which she looked back on with the most regret. To her Eurosceptic supporters, this was the moment when she should have said no. This was when the federal character of the European project was laid bare. At the final news conference at the European Summit, Mrs. Thatcher was upbeat. She was particularly pleased that she had been able to insert a line confirming the rights of member states to keep control of immigration from outside the EEC and maintain their ability to act on a national basis to fight crime and terrorism. It hardly seems much of a victory now. Mrs. Thatcher was totally in agreement with the main thrust of the treaty, which was to make sure that there really was a free movement of goods and services within the EEC. But it was already obvious that for some of the most powerful figures in Europe, this could only be achieved completely with a common currency. It was also significant that the new treaty would change the name of the European Assembly. Henceforth it would be described officially as the European Parliament. Mrs. Thatcher's record over the Single European Act is still a matter of considerable controversy. To her it mattered deeply that looking back over her time in government, people would be able to say she always stood up for Britain. Norman Tebbit was unrepentant about the support he gave Mrs. Thatcher over the negotiations. He told me if we had not conceded a great deal on majority voting, the French would have been able to block every attempt to open their markets. He rejects the idea put round by some of Mrs. Thatcher's supporters that she did not understand the implications of what was being proposed. What we didn't understand, he said, is that legal disputes would be decided on the basis of the European view of law as opposed to the British view of law. The British view, as he put it, is that law is something that is written down, whereas judges in the European Court would tend to come out in favour of arguments which would further the cause of European integration. Mrs. Thatcher felt that what had started as an economic issue was turned into a political weapon to hasten the drive towards a federal Europe. She was determined not to make that mistake again. But she did precisely that when she agreed in 1990 that Britain should join the exchange rate mechanism. It is worth considering the view of the man who would become Mrs. Thatcher's third Chancellor. End of Disc 1.